well. And you definitely don't have to call me Dr. Fox. You can just call me Caroline. And this is where we are in the Northwest Territories. So it's a rough day. It's maybe 30 or 40 knots out there. So I'm at Dalhousie and I study whales, but I've also studied birds and wolves and birds like swans and geese and fishes. And right now I work on endangered species, particularly the North Atlantic right whale, which I'll talk about in a second here. So I just wanted to set the stage for the project. It's called the Whales Habitat and Listening Experiment. That's WHA. It's a project that focuses largely on North Atlantic right whales, but all baleen whales on both sides of the coast, Pacific and Atlantic. And so let's start with who right whales are for a second here. So these are the North Atlantic right whales. Their scientific name is Euprasialis, which in one translation anyway means true whale of the ice. And they are one of the most endangered species on the planet. So current estimates are that about 450 of these animals are left on the planet. And when I say baleen whale, you know what that means. So unlike us, who we have teeth, baleen whales have a different set of mouth parts. And baleen mouth parts are kind of like a sieve. And so if you've ever tried to strain water out of pasta, that is very much how North Atlantic right whales feed as well. So a North Atlantic right whale will take a huge mouthful of water, and they have this sieve-like mouth parts called baleen, and they'll push all the water out through the baleen, and it will leave them with a mouthful of their favorite food, which in this case are called copepods. And copepods, all they are, they're these small animals of the ocean. They're about the size of a grain of rice, and so these are 60-ton animals that feed off of mouthfuls of rice-sized food in the deep ocean. And so my project on whale is, it's one tiny piece of a much larger project. So we collaborate with Fisheries and Oceans Canada. There are researchers in Canada and the US that have devoted decades of their research to protecting North Atlantic right whales. And my project is just one small piece. So let's go to one of those places. It's off the coast of Nova Scotia. It's one of the places that is considered of critical importance to right whales. So it's called Roseway Basin. And in 2016, it was special designation. So it's considered critical habitat to right whales. And what that means is that that habitat is crucial to their persistence in the coming years. And so right whales gather in Roseway Basin off Nova Scotia, and they gather there to socialize, much like we do on recess. And they also gather there to forage very heavily on their copepod prey. And so whales are not too different from you and I. If you need a reliable meal, you're not going to go to a place that doesn't have a lot of food. You're going to go to a place where you can reliably access your food, and Roseway Basin is one of those. So it's a place that's difficult to reach. It's often stormy, and so vessels and airplanes are often limited from accessing Roseway Basin, which means our ability to monitor these whales is often limited as well. And that's where robots come in. So we use these 2-meter long, yet bright yellow cylinders that are called ocean gliders. And ocean gliders are pretty remarkable. You can deploy them off the back of a boat, and they will dive through the ocean down to 200 meters, surface again 200 meters, and they'll cruise across 2,000 kilometers of open ocean over several months. And they can do that in conditions that are far too rough for us as these, landlubber primates of land to access them. And so these gliders are equipped with hydrophones, and all hydrophones are underwater microphones. And these gliders move through the ocean, and what they're doing is they're listening for whales. So whales, like songbirds on land, they have recognizable, identifiable calls. And so these gliders will detect a whale. On board, there's a computer system that will automatically classify that whale call, with some measure of error. The glider can surface, and then it will transmit a signal via satellite to researchers at Dalhousie, telling them there's 2 right whale calls detected here, maybe 1 sei whale, 1 humpback, 1 blue whale. If you deploy these gliders over the ocean for months at a time, thousands of kilometers at a time, you can get this really remarkable understanding of where whales are, when they're there, and what the habitat looks like when they're there. And so we use this information in a couple different ways. One is called near real time. So there are plans on the coast to alert mariners, meaning captains of vessels, about where whales are. And the reason why that's important is that, well, in particular, North Atlantic right whales are struck by ships. You might have seen the news about this all summer. A number of right whales were found in the Gulf of St. Lawrence and elsewhere. Several had been struck by ships. And so one of the great things about this project moving forward is that if you know where whales are in near real time, you have the ability for ships to change course and to slow down in order to protect those whales. And the other way you can use that information, and this is actually the way I use that information right now, is that we try to understand the characteristics of the habitat, the type of habitat that these whales are preferring. Go back to Roseway Basin. We are finding that there are a greater number of whale calls in deep water, in water that's salty, in water that has a sloped ocean bottom. We call it sloped ocean basin. And what we think is happening is that those whales are in areas where their copepod prey or their copepod food is concentrating in really high numbers. And so knowing where those whales are in Roseway Basin, we can then send these gliders out into, you know, the great blue yonder, looking for places where there are whales, but also looking for places that we call, you know, special places for whales where their food is reliably accessed. And the overall picture here is that we're looking for important habitat for whales. If you know where those areas are, you can work then to provide protection for the habitat. If you provide protection for the habitat, you can protect those whales. And so because they're an endangered species in Canada and the US, and there's only 450 left, process has been going on for a number of decades to the whales. The decisions we make today and the choices we make now will determine whether the future hopefully has more right whales in it. And that's for the introduction on right whales.
That sounds like a truly amazing project. Thank you for the project. I was listening to you say that there was a yellow cylindrical sort of mini submarine is what came to mind that you use. And how many of them do you deploy at a time?
Sorry, can you just say that one more time?
Sure. I'm wondering how many of those ocean robots you use at a time.
I deploy one at a time. There are several owned by Ocean Tracking Network. And so we generally put one glider seasonally in Roseway Basin. This summer there was a glider in the Gulf of St. Lawrence as well. So there's, you know, as the years go on, hopefully we have more and more gliders that we can deploy into the water. And you're exactly right, they are kind of like mini submarines, right? They're 2 meters long, they're bright yellow, they're narrow cylinders mounted with all sorts of scientific equipment. They are quite time consuming to monitor, to make sure that they're on course and to gather the information from them. So right now, we just have a couple gliders, but I see in the coming years, hopefully we have many more.
I have a question for those students. Are you in Saskatchewan? Give me a thumbs up if that. Yay, hi. Do you guys, oh, there you go, there's your question. It says, have you seen any whales yet on the expedition?
So I have not yet. So I only got on board about 5 days ago. They did see a number of whales along the Atlantic coast. They've seen bowheads in the eastern part of the Arctic. So far, we've only seen a couple bearded seals, which are remarkable creatures. I've never seen them before. But we are apparently in an area, we're told by the guides here on board, Roger and others, that we are an area where we may see bowhead whales, potentially beluga whales as well.
That sounds really good. Do you have any other questions, Saskatchewan? Because I know I have one. We had questions from the public here in the Canada C3 Hub, and some of those questions were things like, how old do whales get? And so I actually want to know that. How old do whales get?
It depends on the whale. So for many whales, we don't know how old they get. We've only been studying them from a scientific perspective for the last several hundred years. There are certain whales that we know are hundreds of years old. For North Atlantic right whales, those whales are, some of them can get up to at least 50 years, very likely much older. But it really depends on the whale species you're talking about. Some are incredibly ancient animals.
I saw a question pop up. I think it was, how did you become a whale researcher?
Oh, that's a great question. It was an accident. I never was one of those people that said I want to be a marine biologist when I grow up. I thought I was going to be a musician for many years. And I've studied all sorts of things, whales and bears and wolves and birds and now whales. And one of the whales, again, one of the reasons I tend to work so broadly is that I do a lot of math. And so a lot of the math I do translates from wolves very well to bears, and very well to whales as well. And my overarching questions tend to be, what are the characteristics of the habitat that is important to these species? You know, where do they aggregate in time? Where do they aggregate in space? What are the things that are important to them? And so that gives me an ability as a researcher to really move between species, move between coasts. It's been exciting. And I would have to say that whales are one of the toughest species to study because they're often offshore. They live in very difficult to access environments that are very rough. They spend a lot of their time underwater. And so for me, it's remarkable not to just work on whales, but to use these underwater robots, to use this brand new technology in a really fascinating way to answer questions that have been asked for decades.
So I saw two more questions pop up. One was, do whales have names? And I'm going to assume, Saskatchewan, that means that like for each other. And oh no, I missed the other one. And I have a question for both you, Dr. Fox, and for you, Nick, that says, what is the, oops, no, not that one. Wait. How do we help whales if they are endangered? So that's for both of you after you answer the first one about the names. Please.
What was the one about their names, sorry?
I believe the question from Saskatchewan was, do whales have names? And I'm going to assume that means for each other. Can you guys give me a thumbs up if that's right? Whales,
that's a great question. Nick, you go ahead if you want.
Go ahead, Nick.
Hello? I can't answer the question, do they have names? I have to defer to you on that one.
Okay, well, some whales do. Usually there are names that we've given to them. So there are killer whales on the west coast of Canada, a particular population of southern residents, and they're all photographed. And so you photograph them along their dorsal side where their dorsal fin is. And every single one of those whales, after they're born, is generally encountered by researchers or others who photograph them. They know who their mothers are, they know what pod they're in, they can recognize them by their features and their given names. But as to whether whales name each other, I'm not sure we'll ever be able to know that. We absolutely know that they communicate with each other. They often live in very, particularly for killer whales, they live in matriarchal pods. They're certainly known to each other. Whether they give each other names is a question I can't answer, but it's a good one.
So for the second question, it was, what's the most, how come I keep wanting to ask? I'm going to ask it eventually, but right now I want to know, how do we help whales if they're in danger? So Nick, I'm going to let you go first, and then Dr. Fox, you can follow up with your answer, please.
Sure. So I think the first step is to understand what's causing their decline. And in the world of whales, we have to recognize that whales were historically harvested for their oil and for other products that were valued by humans at the time. So the fact that whaling only really stopped this century is something important to understand. In that context, the whales now are under different kind of threats. They're not necessarily being hunted, but they are being affected by human activities like fishing, the nets that are used for fishing, and the lines that are used for some of the line fisheries. They're impacted by ships and ship strikes, and they're impacted by contaminants. So pollution is a big impact on some of the St. Lawrence estuary beluga, for example. So in order to protect them, the first thing we need to know is what's hurting them, what's harming them, and then we need to build the support from all of those people that are out on the ocean that may not be aware that they're having an impact on the whales. So there's a lot of education and information that needs to be presented. And when the scientists do good research and present good, credible evidence, it's a lot easier to convince them, the different players, that they need to change their practices and change their behaviors. So the work that we're doing now and the work that Carolyn is doing is really, really important to be able to explain what's happening to them and then how we can modify some of the way we use the ocean. Carolyn, did you want to add more details?
Sure, and I absolutely agree with what you said. I think that's one of the reasons as a scientist I work on endangered species, whales and other species as well. One of the things we often lack is information. We talk about it as knowledge gaps, and in order to help whales, you really need to know something about them. You need to know the challenges they face, what their population is. You need to know their histories. Often very complicated, particularly if it was a whale that was subjected to centuries of commercial harvesting. And so for right whales, their conservation issues can be very different from other species, and so you really need to narrow down and ask certain questions. And so for things like, say, the toothed southern resident killer whales on the Pacific coast, some of their major issues are food supply. So they don't have enough Chinook salmon to eat all the time, and they live in an ocean that is very noisy, and it interferes their ability to feed. Those challenges are very different for a North Atlantic right whale, which has issues in terms of being struck by ships or entangled in fishing gear. And they're also very thought to be changing their foraging habitats because they live in a very changeable, very dynamic ocean, and finding those reliable areas of copepods seems to be shifting for those species. And so I think science plays a tremendous role, but ultimately these are decisions that we make as a society, as a multicultural society, to protect whales and to protect their habitats. One of the things we have in Canada is the Species at Risk Act, and North Atlantic right whales are listed as endangered, and that means there are all sorts of steps that are put in motion to try and protect those whales. And one of the key things we do is try to find information about them, really quantitatively ask questions on what are their major threats, what are the reasons these populations haven't recovered. And what I'll say to maybe as an ending is that I spent a lot of time on the West Coast, and we have seen remarkable signs of recovery in many populations. Humpbacks, gray whales, fin whales. These are species that when I was a kid were incredibly rare, and you see these trips on the coast, and these whales kind of reclaim their historical habitats, and it's something that's been seen on the Atlantic coast as well. And so I hope that that is the future for right whales, that they put themselves, with our help, on a trajectory for recovery, and that they, in 20, 30, 50 years, are no longer a species at risk.
Thank you to both of you. Now, I have some other questions in my back pocket, literally, that had come from the audience previously. And one of the things that people want to know is, how big is whale poop?
Oh, Depends on the whale, I guess, is the best answer I can give you. Right whales are enormous. They can be 60 or 70 tons, which is an enormous whale. And if you're an enormous whale, generally your poop is pretty enormous too.
Awesome. That's kind of the answer I expected, but I still had to ask. The other thing I wanted to know, well, not just me, but of course our ever-questioning public, is how do whales breathe? Now, we know that they swim around, but I think that some people may not be so clear about just how exactly whales breathe, especially those that are in the Arctic and maybe spend a lot of their time hanging out in and around, not in, under or around the ice.
Another good question. So they are distant cousins, right? These are animals that went back into the sea. They have lungs like we do. They can't spend hours and hours underwater, so they need to continuously surface and breathe. And one of the ways that, as a researcher, I see whales over the surface of the ocean is when they surface, there'll be a big spout of air. We call it a blow. Those will be a big whale's blow, and they're essentially expelling air out of their blowhole. And that's one of the ways we see them. It's one of the ways, it's how they breathe. And so whales in the Arctic have different challenges, same as whales in the Antarctic. They often have to aggregate in areas where there is open water. So in the north, you can find places called polynyas. We're in an area where there is persistent polynya every winter. And what I mean by that is an area of persistent open water. So it's an area where a lot of mammals, because they need to come to the surface to breathe, you will often find them aggregated at these polynyas throughout the winter.
Thank you. Hey, Saskatchewan, I saw you laughing. Do you have any other questions for Dr. Fox? Do we have any from our fine studio audience? Oh, we do. We do.
Which ones do you want me to ask again? Are they aggressive? Are the whales aggressive?
Oh, there are stories back in the day when there was commercial whaling all over the seas, all over the world seas, of whales being aggressive towards ships. That's fairly somewhat well documented, and it's very likely when in close quarters, when ships were harpooning whales, that there were definitely damage to vessels when you're trying to harpoon an extremely large, extremely strong animal. But probably the best example I have is, southern resident killer whales, all killer whales. They're called killer whales, but they are eaters of salmon and herring, and they're eaters of small marine mammals like seals and sea lions. And as far as I know, and all the researchers that I work with, they definitely know who you are as a human, but you're not dinner to a killer whale. They're generally going about their business just like everyone else, and so no, they're certainly not predators on humans like we may have with some of the carnivores on land.
How long do the whales live for?
Oh, so we had a similar question to that earlier, and my answer was it depends on the whale.
Okay.
Are very long-lived and can live, it's thought, well into their hundreds. There was a killer whale on the west coast called Granny, and she got to be 100 years old. For North Atlantic right whales, it's still not fully known what the upper limit of their age is. It's at least 50 years. It's very likely up into 100 years old.
Are you doing your research for the whole exhibition?
I wish. I might have to be a stowaway here. I'm only on board for 10 days, but this is definitely being on a boat. I am often at the bow in the morning before everyone gets up other than the crew, and I'm on the bow watching for whales and watching for birds, and it's one of the most amazing places to be, whether you're on the Atlantic or Arctic or Pacific coast.
One more question. How do you feel about SeaWorld?
Oh, good question. I have a very complicated relationship with captive marine mammals, and I've never been to an aquarium. I was just raised to, as a kid, I was raised to not not to support captive animals in aquariums. However, I think zoos and aquariums have really changed over the decades. They've had a much greater role in research, and what we're seeing is they're playing a really significant role in doing endangered species research, and in some cases, particularly for terrestrial animals, they are the last resort, for captive breeding of species that have become extinct in the wild. And so I work deliberately and intentionally on wild species with low impact research protocols. So I work in nature, and I definitely see that aquariums have a role for research and for conservation. But from a captive perspective, I don't support animals in captivity.
We have a question here for both of you. Specifically, how can a fishing net harm a whale? So I don't know which one of you would like to go first.
Sure, I can start. Well, there are two kinds of fishing nets. Well, there are probably more, but you have to think about nets in the sense of a net with a connection of ropes all coming together. And then we have the line fisheries where you have traps at the bottom of the ocean with a single vertical line. So each of them has a potential impact. I know that for the North Atlantic right whale, most of the concerns right now are around single rope lines that are vertical. They basically hang in water columns. And in order for the whales to move through, they have to literally go through a whole series of vertical lines. And it's those vertical ropes that get entangled around the fins of the whales. So those are, that's, I think, beginning of the answer. I personally have not seen this, so maybe Caroline, you have seen this in your research?
I have. It's quite common to see entangled seals and sea lions. I see the occasional entangled whale, and how it happens, well, like you said, it really depends on the kind of fishing gear that they're entangled with. A good example for North Atlantic right whales is that they can move as they're moving through the ocean, they essentially get caught up on fishing gear. And one of the types of fishing gear that they can get caught up in are lobster and crab traps. And so it might wrap around their tail or wrap around their pectoral fins or wrap through their mouth. And these animals, in the past, I'm told, this isn't part of my research, but in the past we used ropes made of hemp and jute, and these 60-ton whales could very readily break that rope. But with the advent of modern plastics, our ropes are becoming stronger and stronger, and so these whales will drag a crab or lobster pot sea floor. They'll drag it or all the way to Florida, and then all the way back the next year because those ropes are so strong that the whales can't easily break them. And so we have Fisheries and Oceans Canada and many others do really remarkable disentanglement measures. So they'll go out and try to cut those whales free. And there's another research activity that's happening to actually lessen the strength of these ropes so that fishermen can still use them to commercially fish a number of different species, but for a right whale, that rope is actually weak enough that it can be more readily broken. So again, it depends on the species, but and it depends on the net, but entanglement is fairly common worldwide, and that's one of the great things about our country is that when you see an entangled marine mammal, whether it's a whale, a seal, or a sea lion, there is a hotline to report it, and if it's within reach of rescuers, then often there is an attempt made to rescue those whales.
I didn't know that. Thank you for sharing that with us. So we can call the entanglement hotline. So thank you, Saskatchewan. We're waving off. We still have some questions here, though, so you guys can log on later and watch the end of this. Some questions I have for both you, Dr. Fox, and for you, Nick, are, well, we know that the oceans are noisy because Dr. Fox listens to them. So, but how does the sort of extra noise, the noise pollution, how does that affect the whales?
Do you want me to tackle that first?
Yes, please.
Okay, so again, it depends on the whale. So for a toothed whale like killer whales, so these are the hunters of salmon and hunters of seals and sea lions. So they need a quiet ocean so they can communicate with the rest of their pod because they're essentially hunting as a group. So they need to talk to each other in order to effectively hunt together, and they need to be able to listen for their prey. So noise impacts in a different way, that they need quiet oceans so they can communicate with each other and they can hunt more effectively. For something like whale, so these are again those whales that strain, they're big pasta strainers, right? They strain food out with their mouth parts. Noise affects them perhaps in different ways. So we think about as our gliders are moving through the ocean, you know, going down to 200 meters and back up, we hear a lot of ships. Our ocean gliders detect a lot of ships, and often you hear that it's overlain with whale calls. And so these are whales that are calling from the depths of the ocean, and they're communicating over tens and hundreds, and in some cases thousands of kilometers with each other. And so as the ocean gets noisier, it really is changing what we call the soundscape of the sea, and it impacts how they communicate with each other.
I would just add that there are many different kinds of noise and many different sources of noise as well. So I think the research community is looking at the effect of seismic activities. That's when oil and gas industry is looking to map the seabed, and they use sound waves in the water. Another example of the sound that's generated is from sonar coming from the Navy and from military vessels. And so there are many different kinds of sound that are being generated as well that we seek to manage to avoid impacts to whales.
Thank you, both of you. And one final question. What kind of human activities can harm whales, and am we, individually, contributing?
I can start. I think that we've outlined at the beginning some of the big threats that we're concerned about. Fishing, entanglement, shipping, ship strikes, noise. But some of the things that people are less aware of are things like contaminants and the way in which we may be using certain chemicals, we might be flushing things down the toilet, not being aware that everything ends up in the ocean. And so I would add to the list probably the one that we as individual citizens impact directly is through the use of chemicals and through the use of plastics. So those are just two examples. I think the marine industries, the shipping sector, the fishing sector, oil and gas are some of the kind of industries that are leading, but there's definitely human impact as well.
Ross, the four things going up, so
if you're waiting for me to respond, I would love to, but there was so much of that signal that was lost, so you might have to repeat the question to me.
Well, I was just saying that I think we've identified early the issue around shipping and around fishing, but some of the more the impacts that we as individuals make in things like contaminants, the use of chemicals, and those are things that we can manage as individuals rather than look at others to try and see the problem. I think pollutants and plastics are two examples of things that I worry about, and I think that are things that we can tackle as individuals.
I think that's a great point. You know, there's things that we can do as a society, as a nation. There's things we can do, you know, regionally, as communities and as individuals, and sometimes they overlap and sometimes they don't. And whales, depending on the species, you know, they face a litany of threats, and some are endangered and others really are in the midst of these long recoveries from commercial whaling. And so there are 6 horizon, and there are things that we can do as individuals to help not just whales, but their habitats and all the diversity of marine species that live in our oceans.
Thank you both for this very much. I see that it's getting busier and busier where you are, Dr. Fox. So I think that we're about to sign off, but I'm going to encourage the people here with us right now and everybody who's going to watch this later to participate in Let's Talk Whales. And we're going to talk about whales on this project sort of in-house here. But thank you again for your time, and I guess we will see you later.
Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much, Dr. Cox. Bye.
Bye.